Al Perek Beis Halacha Beis in Hilchos Shofar. We're learning the Rambam in Hilchos Shofar. Kol mi she'enoi chaya b'dava. Somebody who's not obligated in a certain commandment. Ein moitzes hachaya b'yidei chavoso. You cannot fulfill the obligation of the person who's obligated. We just learned the woman is not obligated in Shofar. She cannot fulfill the obligation of someone who is. Lefikoch, therefore, isha ikotin. Let's see what it says in the Peirush. So somebody who's not liable cannot fulfill the obligation of one who's liable. Therefore, therefore a woman or a minor should talk about shofar, even though they themselves have fulfilled their own mitzvah, somebody who hears them will not fulfill his mitzvah. Now we have a proof to the question of the Kabbos Timorim that we mentioned in the first halacha. If the mitzvah is to blow or to hear, and if we'll say the mitzvah is to hear, why do you need to have the one blowing it? Somebody has an obligation, but it still needs further clarification. Here you see that the hearing that itself doesn't help. Androgenous moitzias minoin, somebody has both private parts, can fulfill the obligation of someone else who has the same problem. But he cannot do Sheinamino. He cannot fulfill somebody who is a definite male. The source is in Rosh Hashanah 29a. Going to Rae, androgynous can fulfill the obligation of other androgynes, but because that only applies if we say he is his own being. It's, in other words, just like there's a male, there's a female, there's an androgyne. But according to the opinion that he's half male and half female, then the half that is a female cannot fulfill the obligation of the part that's a male who has a full obligation. The Mosdos writes, according to the Rambam, an androgyne is like half slave and half freed, and even himself he cannot fulfill his obligation. What does it mean his own being? The Yom Trua says it's a question if we judge him either like a male or a female, and therefore he can fulfill their obligation. Thus the Rambam decided that androgyne is its own species. And so the Rif says, my Mishnah points out that even let's say the androgyne is half male and half female, still it could be he can fulfill the obligation of his own species, but he's not the same as an Eved who's half free, because there's a difference between what we find that what was created by man to what was created by heaven. If somebody's created that way, then he might be able to fulfill his own obligations. The Rambam continues in Hilchos Perek Beis Halacha Gimel Hilchos Shofar that here he goes into the question of someone who's half freed and half slave. In continuation of Beis, the Rambam says Tumtum Eina Moitzi, somebody who has neither his parts are covered and we don't know if it's male or female, cannot fulfill the obligation either of a male or a female, nor of somebody else, because the other person might be a male, not a female. Nor a male or a female. Because once the tumtum has been surgically opened and we see whether he's male or female, we'll find that maybe it's a male. We could find that it's a female. Therefore, they cannot fill the obligations of the other. Here in Gimel, the Peirush, it says somebody who's half a slave and half a freed person cannot even fulfill his own obligations. Even if he blows by himself, he doesn't fulfill it, because because half of the blast is being blown by his slave, and that cannot fulfill the obligation of the half who is a freed person. How can he fulfill his obligation? He should hear it from a freed person who will blow for him, and that will fulfill the obligation of the freed person. So there's three types of levels. half a slave and half a freed person cannot fulfill the obligation or even of himself. Somebody who has, we don't know what they are, can fulfill their own obligation, but not that of another person whose private parts are not visible. And an androgyne can fulfill the obligation of another androgyne. In the regard to a person who's deaf, the Mechaber in the Hilchos Yesodei writes in 589:2 that he cannot fulfill even if he speaks and he doesn't hear, since he's not obligated, because the mitzvah is to hear, if we can't fulfill the obligation of others. But if somebody hears but he can't speak, which is called a mute, Rambam says they can fulfill others' their obligation, because the obligation is to hear, and he's doing that. On the second day of Rosh Hashanah, when it's only the Rabbanon, the Mishnah Berurah writes, according to the Pri Megadim, that we enforce all of the stringencies that are just in the first day, just like it would be the first day.